All right, hey Stat 13 people. So we're gonna use this video to go ahead and finish off our section on collecting data. And so it's just gonna be about experiments. So to go ahead and correspond with what we did in the last video about observational studies. And so yeah, you might have noticed that like up to this point, we've hardly had like any sort of numbers at all, really. So if you kind of took stats expecting and wanting to deal with numeric data more often, then you're in luck because starting with the next video, we'll start talking about describing and graphing numeric data. Okay, so for our experiment, we're sticking with our sleep exam example. And so if we do this study but use a randomized experiment instead of the observational study, what's going to happen is that our subjects are now going to be randomly assigned to a control and a treatment group. And so in our sleep example, we might randomly select half of the stat 113 students, so randomly select about half and then force these students, I think we defined like 8+ hours as getting good enough sleep, and then force these students to get 8+ hours of sleep. And then force the other half to get less than 8 hours of sleep. And so kind of right away, you might be thinking that like, okay, this experimental setup, it might not really be that ethical, which we'll get into at the bottom of this page, and it might not even really be feasible, which kind of sucks. So there are, with experiments, kind of a lot of practical issues that can pop up. We're going to skip over the definitions of placebo and placebo effect because they don't really apply that much to this particular example. But we are going to talk about what blind and double-blind experiments are. And so these are terms that pop up especially a lot in psychology. And so a blind experiment is an experiment where a subject does not know which group they were put into. All right, so like in this case, it's again kind of hard to connect it to this because students would know what group based on the amount of sleep they would get. For double blind, it's neither the subject nor the researcher knows. Which group each subject was put into. So this can be important, the researcher part, to kind of eliminate some researcher bias. And so if I'm, not that I would ever do this, but if I kind of want a certain result from this study, it might influence the way that I would grade the exams, whether that occurs consciously or even subconsciously. This is just the safest way. If I don't know which student got which treatment, then the exam grading is going to be fair across the two groups. So, advantages of an experiment is that you can infer causation. And so you can do this because confounding variables all of those are going to be balanced when we randomly assign students to groups. And so you could think about when we randomly assign students to groups. So you could think about like our example of a confounding variable was preparedness in the observational study. And so what would happen in the experiment is that when we do this random assignment to the treatment and control group, about half of the prepared students are going to go to the 8+ hours of sleep group, and about half are going to go to the less than 8 hours of sleep group. About half of the unprepared students are going to go to the 8+ hours of sleep group, and then about half will go to the less than 8 hours. And so both groups are getting prepared students and unprepared students. So that's why it's balanced out in this experimental setting where it was an issue in the observational study. All right, so some disadvantages to experiments. They're often difficult and not really this example, but sometimes expensive to carry out. And they also can be unethical. And so take a second to go ahead and pause the video for a moment and think about some ethical issues with this experiment. Okay, so I think the most obvious ethical issue, at least to me, is that can we force students to get a certain amount of sleep? Is that ethical to do? So even with student consent, which you would definitely need, still, can we kind of force some students to be sleep deprived? That's an ethical consideration, and that could potentially hurt their grade. Another kind of ethical thing that pops up in some studies is like, what if we do, think about that stent study where some patients get a stent, some don't. What if halfway through the study you realize that the patients who got the stent are doing way better than the patients who didn't? Is it ethical to carry on and finish out the study, which I think was an entire year? Or do you stop the study and give the patients that didn't get the stent a stent so that they have a better chance of survival? So that doesn't really match up with how the data actually turned out in that example, but you could think of those types of scenarios popping up quite a bit. So in a lot of these experiments, there's kind of these health ethical issues where if a treatment's actually working, when do you stop the experiment to give everyone the beneficial treatment? Okay, so like I said before, this is the last of the data collection stuff, so I'm excited to move on to some data exploration stuff, which we'll start with the next video.